Welcome, everyone, to the third event of our fall season, New York Technology Council. Delighted to have you here. Let me start by mentioning, as you know, the topic tonight is going to be Secret of Scaling a Tech Organization. Michael Bryzek, CTO here at Gilt, is going to give us an interesting talk. I've heard part of it before, so I know it's very interesting. But let me first tell you a little about NYTECH, for those who don't know. We're a nonprofit. We're all about collaboration and innovation here in New York, and we try to bridge the gap between technology and business. I want to thank our annual sponsors. May sound trite, but without them we wouldn't be here tonight. They provide the majority of our funding. We're doing a three-part series with Gilt. Tonight's the first, and then we've got one next Tuesday, and then a week from Thursday, 2 weeks from tomorrow, on aspects of technology where Gilt is make some real innovations. So, as you know, Michael Bryzek is CTO of Gilt Groupe, and he's going to be talking tonight about scaling a tech organization, and what the title doesn't say, and perhaps should, is in today's world. If you go back 25 years ago, things were very different. If you wanted to move data from one place to another, you'd call up the phone company, put in an order. 6-8 weeks later, you get a private line which will take your data to one other place. And we take the internet for granted, but 25 years ago, few people were using it, but it's nothing like it is now. And 25 years ago, much of the innovation happened in big research organizations, IBM Labs, Bell Labs, where thousands of researchers were together, diverse lot, trading ideas, but moving fairly slowly. Because the world moved fairly slowly. Things were complicated, they're interconnected. You had to worry about moving something here, you might break something there, and so one had to move cautiously. Internet has changed all that. Architecture is very loosely coupled, so you can change something here, it may not work, but you're not going to break something there, almost certainly. And organizations are very different. Back 25 years ago at Bell Labs, if you were a member technical staff doing technical work, there were 7 layers of management above you in the labs alone, each reporting up the line. And beyond that, there were probably three layers at AT&T, the mothership. So you had 10 managers above you, and if it was a big enough problem, it would have to go all the way up and then all the way down, and nothing ever happened outside of that chain. That was unknown now. So none of you, I'm sure, is an organization with that many layers of management. If you came in one day and discovered it, you'd be completely confused and I'm sure get nothing done. So Michael's going to talk tonight about how to solve the challenges, business challenges of today's world, particularly in terms of delivering tech at the speed that's required now. Michael?
Thank you, Eric, and thanks for hosting tonight. And on behalf of Gilt, thank you for everything that NYTECH is doing for the New York tech community. It's been amazing to watch what's happening here. So tonight what I wanted to really talk about is this simple idea of trust. And trust really being that single ingredient, probably the most important ingredient that actually helps us scale a tech organization. It helps us hire, it helps us recruit great people, it helps us deliver value. And we'll talk about how this has emerged and how we've managed this at Gilt. I think at a high level, if we look at any organization, essentially behind the company are people. And there are assets, there is a brand, there's always other things, but fundamentally a company is made up of the people behind it. And the basic idea here is that if we could create true trust within an organization, then people will create great things. And a lot of this is thinking about differences over time on how we act and behave in workplace and how we act and behave with our friends and our family. And essentially the merging of those worlds where maybe actually if the workplace were more like our family and private lives, we actually could feel the same way. So can we create that? So today I'll talk about our story of scaling a technology startup here in New York from 0 people to over 1,000 people today, where every day great people contribute beautiful code, and innovate constantly. If you don't know about Gilt, let me ask this. How many people here are Gilt members? If you're not a Gilt member, I encourage you to go to gilt.com, gilt.com. So Gilt, when we started Gilt, the idea was really, how do we offer the best products and brands in the world at a discount to consumers? And the brands that we worked with had a real problem. They wanted to move excess inventory, but didn't have enough discrete channels to do so. So conceptually, we would go to our brands, the brands we wanted to work with, and ask them, do you have any excess inventory? And they would say, no, our brand is so amazing that anything we produce, our customers buy. And then we would become friends and actually find out that, you know what, we actually have this warehouse and there are a few things lying around that we would love to move, but we don't want to risk any damage to our brand. Can you help us solve that problem? And that was a real problem. And so Gilt brought to the US this idea that for 36 hours only, you could have access to the best products and brands in the world at a discount. The brands are happy, customers love it, and a business emerged. So to come back to tonight and really thinking about how we scaled Gilt Group, particularly in the technology organization, and really the first question is, why does it matter? And Eric touched on this a little bit. I unfortunately never had the pleasure of using punch cards. I've seen them in museums. But I think the question of timing is pretty important. Why now? Why are we talking about this now? And I think there are a few different pieces. Traditionally, there's this idea that as companies have grown up, what we create is bureaucracy and process. And all those things, like our tax code, are well-intentioned, right? There's always a good reason for one of those things to be added. Over time, though, those things tend not to be taken out of the organizations that we build and result in process and bureaucracy. And that then leaves a big window for startups to come in and create innovation and oftentimes leapfrog over kind of the older, now bureaucratic companies. When you think about innovation just broadly, one of the more interesting things as companies have grown is for most companies, they will live a long and healthy life with very little innovation, growing at 1%, 2%, 3% a year, staying flat. When you talk to these companies and you ask them where their growth is coming from, almost all of them will say our growth comes from innovation, and innovation is a driver of our growth. And so many companies are out there trying to figure out how can we innovate more. I'd argue or suggest that actually nobody has figured out how to create innovation. It's not what we try to do here at Gilt. If somebody had figured out how to create innovation, we would all be doing it. And so what we've really focused on is, can we create an environment where we allow for an innovation to happen? Take away the things that we know stop innovation and allow for our people to innovate. And the last piece that's happening now is the millennial generation. So I just missed being a millennial, and my younger brother is a millennial. I define this term as entering high school with the internet, with the browser. And that meant a lot of things that are really subtle. But one of them is that if you had a browser when you went to high school, you never learned to use a library. You never learned to ask your teacher or your parent where you can go to find information. You never learned to ask your manager, who in the organization might I talk to? Who is the expert on this topic? Because you didn't need to. The information was easily accessible. And that access to information, even finding out who to ask, is one of those big features of hierarchy. It's a big feature of corporations. And you just don't need it anymore. And so as the millennials more and more enter the workforce, they're coming in this expectation that when this biggest value of this corporate structure that we've developed over time is just irrelevant today. So over time, it's now about 2 years ago, we started really thinking about how we might change the way we manage things at Gilt. And over time, we've come to call this the social experiment. I'd say that we were not wise enough 2 years ago to know that actually what we were doing would be such an experiment on how people interact together. But that is what it became. And the basic idea was, can we empower small teams to innovate autonomously? And generally move from this notion of ideas and backlogs to execution and innovation. And I want to touch on innovation a little bit and see if we can define it. So a lot of people think that innovation is having an idea. And in some cases, there are ideas that are just amazing. They're very, very rare. And to really, when we look around, when we look at innovation, it includes a lot of things. In many cases, it starts with having an idea. It includes R&D, it includes testing, redesigning, building it, getting to market, and using it. And so collectively, we started to think of that as execution. Ideas are great. Execution usually matters most, and most of the time, it really is about execution. So in a nutshell, what we were trying to do at Gilt is think about, given where we were, how we were growing, could we change our focus from ideas to really focus on execution? And just to paint a picture, in an organization that's focused on ideas, people have lots of ideas, and you'll have suggestion boxes, and you'll have meetings to generate ideas, and now you have lots of ideas. And what people like to do with lots of ideas is put them on long spreadsheets or in long ticket tracking systems. Now they have a problem. How do we prioritize these ideas? Well, let's get together and review them, or do an ROI analysis, or debate them, or why don't we build software so people can upvote the ideas that they think are best? And what we end up with is a centralized, single list of all the ideas that we prioritize that will create innovative ideas to drive our company's growth. So 18 months later, we have a prioritized list. And actually nothing has happened and the market has changed. And that is the fundamental difference that we wanted to change. And I think the key to doing this, and what has actually kind of worked here, is to basically give the authority for what we're going to do, give that kind of the power to make the decision on which idea we're actually going to take through and execute on to the people who are actually working on that idea. So to remove kind of the layers of prioritization and ideation, just remove that process, it doesn't matter. To have small teams that actually have the authority to make those decisions. And I put up a slide from Scrum. If you're familiar with Scrum, it's a pretty popular methodology for managing agile software development. I am not the biggest fan of Scrum, but there are a few things that Scrum does particularly well. And one is this notion of chickens and pigs that they introduced. And in Scrum, chickens are people who are watching and contributing valuable ideas and supporting the process, and the pigs are the ones doing the work. And so in Scrum, when you get together for a status meeting, the pigs talk and debate and brainstorm, and the chickens are always welcome to listen but not participate in the conversation. It's kind of one of the ideas from Scrum. And kind of one way to think about this is, say a chicken and a pig went for breakfast and had ham and eggs, and what's the difference in that breakfast? It's really a day's work for a chicken, but a lifetime commitment for a pig, is the way to think about it. Does that kind of resonate with people? Like, really wanted to make sure that the people who had real skin in the game were actually the people who had real authority to make the decisions on which ideas we have and how to execute on those ideas. And if you think about how startups work, it's kind of like that. I mean, startups have ideas and they do ideas and backlogs and prioritization. That's actually what they do. But there's like one idea. So if you have one idea to prioritize, pretty quickly you decide that that's the idea you're going to go take all the way through to execution. There doesn't have to be a lot of time spent up front on that. So that's really what we wanted to bring back. So here's the challenge. Gilt was growing. We were probably, 700 people, 800 people at the time. We started thinking about changing this. A lot of things were working well. Business was growing. Our members loved the experience. We were doing well. So how can we do this? And essentially, we approached it from a few different levels. One, we started to really focus on defining what is the actual strategy for the business. And everybody likes to define strategy. It's a good thing. When you're kind of 5 people, 10 people, 20 people sitting in a room, people kind of get it. When you reach, I would say, 80 people feels like an inflection point for a lot of organizations. 150 is an inflection point, and we had another one around 700 or 800 where we really needed to be crisp on what was the strategy to drive growth in the future of Gilt. By the way, that number 150 is kind of an important number, and I know they're talking to a few of you before. I know there are a lot of people here from small companies, startups, large organizations. We think about the number 150 plus or minus 20 a lot. It was defined as Dunbar's number by a person of the name Dunbar, who did a lot of research into how society evolved. And a lot of his research focused on where we came from, how big our tribes were over the past centuries or thousands of years as we developed into kind of our society today. And it turned out that actually we grew up in societies or tribes with 150 plus or minus 20 people in them. That was kind of the size of the unit through a lot of our development historically. What that means is that our minds, as much as we would love to have 1,000 friends, our minds are adapted to maintaining relationships with about 150 people, plus or minus 20, or plus or minus, you can add 400 if you're my wife, who's exceptionally good at this. But for most of us, it's 150 plus or minus 20. Doesn't mean you have 150 best friends, but you know that where you went on vacation last weekend, you know where you got married, or you know that your sister's in town visiting, enough to have kind of a meaningful human relationship. And it's a really critical number because it means that when we get beyond that, we start to lose that personal connection. And that really drove this need for strategy. One of the best stories I've heard about Dunbar's Law is the company Gore Industries. Gore Industries makes Gore-Tex, pretty successful. They, as they opened their facilities, would build a new facility. They painted 150 parking spots outside. And when people started parking on the lawn, rather than paint more parking spots, they opened another facility. And that was the model, one of the key components that they credit to kind of their phenomenal growth as kind of Gore really, really exploded as a great company. So all that to say that we really started with company strategy. And just as an example, specifically to Gilt, a couple years ago, one of the things we really wanted to do was drive increase top of funnel, so bring more people to Gilt. And so now you can have a conversation about all the different ways you might want to do that. So we did that through something we called initiatives. And initiatives are more focused areas that we would like to invest in. And so in the top of the funnel, as an example, 2 years ago, if you search for a black dress on Google, Gilt was nowhere to be seen because we were 100% discreet. We didn't want to be on Google. And so we were receiving no traffic from search engine optimization. And it was kind of a core part of our business. And in terms of kind of strategy, top of funnel, initiatives, what we decided is why don't we explore search engine optimization for a flash sale business like Gilt, where discretion is super important, where actually the things you can buy or see change on a daily basis. And nobody had done that before. It's kind of interesting. And then we could have a debate around KPIs. And KPIs are key, and I just want to spend a little bit of time on it. So KPI is a key performance indicator, which is a fancy word for a metric. KPIs, so a metric could be, how many users registered in the last 30 days. In the notion of search engine optimization, how many people searched on Google and registered on Gilt in the last 30 days, just as an example. And it seems relatively simple, but they're incredibly powerful because they provide two real benefits. The first is, as soon as you start talking about a metric, a KPI, you can debate it. So I'll give you a really personal example. My wife and I have two boys, 5 and 8, just turning 5. And a few months ago, our dinner, yelled at the 4-year-old to eat his dinner. It was very stressful if you have children to make sure they eat, because if they don't eat, you know that later on you're going to pay for it. And so we started brainstorming and said, we feel bad that we just yelled at our child. Maybe we're yelling at our child too much. And so I looked at my wife and said, we need a KPI. How many times in the last 30 days have we yelled at our 4-year-old? And then all of a sudden my wife says, no, that's crazy. We don't yell that much, do we? And all of a sudden we were focused on actually measuring what we thought was important. We could have the debate. Is it important? Is it not? We don't yell at him that much, a few times a month. But is that the right number? Is it a bad number? And all of a sudden we're thinking about it, having a real conversation. And then what's really important is we can decide to change something. And if we change it, next month when we're having dinner, we can say, well, how did we do last month? Did what we change actually have an impact on the KPI that we both agreed is really important? And while we're debating the KPI at a very practical level, it's real. We've done nothing. We've committed nothing. We haven't spent any money. We haven't spent any thought cycles, yet we're having a real debate. And that's incredibly powerful because we can come to the end of that debate and say, you know what, it's not actually that important. We're not going to focus on it. And that's a super, super critical element of the KPI. It's just to very quickly drive the debate to the fundamental thing that actually matters. So KPIs, they seem simple, it's just a metric, you measure it. I would say it takes on the order of 3 months of debate to reach consensus on the KPI. Once we have KPIs, so the second so that's the first thing, so drive that debate. The second really important thing about KPIs that we'll spend a little bit of time on is this idea that Once you have a KPI, you have a boundary by which a team can form, and as long as they're moving the KPI, you really don't care how they're moving it, right? As long as that thing that you agreed matters, they're ethical and all those things, you don't really care. Business is going in the right direction. You can decide as a group, you can revisit, do we have the right KPIs that roll up into these initiatives, that roll up into our overall corporate strategy? Do we have the right KPIs or not? But the tactics by which we move that KPI actually become less important. And we'll come back to the idea because it's a key idea. And then at Gilt, in theory, the way it works is then we have this, here are all the KPIs, and we have lots of teams that like to work together. And the teams and the KPIs go to like a rapid dating session, and they align. Teams find KPIs that they love. KPIs find teams that will adopt them. And now we have people that are really passionate about a particular KPI. And they can span kind of all sorts of things. Easy to think about KPIs that impact customer experience and revenue. But they're also different KPIs. And one of the teams I'll share kind of on the back end of Gilt is we do a lot around logistics and distribution and supply chain and inventory movement. And my favorite story is that actually one of the teams worked on improving the time, so reducing the number of seconds it takes from clicking submit order to your box being packed and on the UPS truck. And then we had our customers calling us to say, can you please hold my order so I can come home in a couple hours and shop again and get one box from you? So we'd kind of move to the point where within minutes of clicking submit order, your box was on a truck ready to ship, to our customers asking us, actually, why don't you slow that down for me because I want to shop again? It's just a great example. It doesn't have to be something that a customer, it's easy to see customer-facing features, we all interact with them. But across the board, they're incredibly powerful to driving the pieces that matter. So at Gilt, we have teams, and each team is made up of a set of ingredients. And this is something that emerged over time. And we have a few people from Gilt here in the audience. And the first time we did this, we didn't have ingredients. And so when we formed a team, we said we need people who can write code, we need people who can test, we need a product manager, we need a project manager, and et cetera. So typical way to build a team. And then what we found is that on some teams, we had, let's say, a developer with a great product sense and had to work with a product manager. Well, now it's unclear, like who's responsible for product strategy? And that creates tension and friction. And so when we looked deeper, we said, the titles are actually not that important. That company, Gore, remember, everyone in the company, their title is team member. And people learn which team members are better at different things, and they align that way. And so from that experience, we looked at it and said, actually, we don't care about titles and roles. What we do care about is that every team has the dozen or so things that it needs to be successful. And those can vary over team by team. So in technology, okay, you need somebody to write code. You need product strategy. You need product vision. You may or may not need project management, depending on the type of project. You need testing, et cetera. So there's about a dozen ingredients that every team needs. And now as teams start to form, you may have one person, two people, three people, you can start checking off the boxes for which ingredients each person is bringing to that team. And then it becomes an exercise, it's a bin fitting exercise, or bin packing exercise at the end, which is hard. But now you can kind of look at it and say, okay, so we have a gap here on project management. We really like project management because it's a complex project. Now you can go to the project management group and say, will you please come work with us because we really need a project manager. And the project manager is going to be super happy. It's like, yes, I would love to work with you guys. And all of a sudden, the psychology of working together is really, really productive. And if there aren't enough people, then it's obvious that we're going to move forward. We can choose to move forward, and there's a gap. And now we can manage that gap. There are things will fall through, but we kind of know we have a heads up. Just graphically, just kind of how the teams work or kind of look. Where team one here has 5 people on it. The little bubbles are the ingredients that they're bringing to the team. And this team has worked on a first initiative. Say 6 to 12 months later, they took on a new initiative. So they ended their first initiative, took on a new one, decided they wanted to stay together. So teams of Gilt really like to stay together. Is one thing that emerged as well. Become kind of a close-knit group. Same thing with team 2, 4 people, 1 initiative. Team 3, 6 people. They're on to the third initiative. There's these things hanging off the side called repos. Each team can work on multiple code repositories. And I think that's really important. They can have ownership of their own code. And I think one of the kind of interesting things that's emerged with the teams is that it is really nice when people move from team to team, and definitely encouraged. But we found that actually very few people choose to move. Happens, but it's the exception as opposed to the norm. And we love when it happens because the people bring the things that are working for their team to another team. And it could be everything from a different way to do automated testing, a different way to do project management. Maybe team 1 used Scrum, team 2 did something else. And so we really encourage that. So one of the things that, and as we've talked to some of the other companies in New York, I think it was Etsy, where they actually require people, it's like you can only be on a team for up to a year and then you're required to move. It's just a rule they made up. Really thinking about that as well as like, is there more benefit to encouraging more frequent movement across the teams to drive sharing? So I want to come back to KPIs, and this just really is the important step, is that kind of the KPIs offer the ability to manage by KPI, which is what gives teams autonomy. And it's this difference between the CEO stopping by and saying, I actually think if the button were green, conversion would be higher, or whatever the request is. It's the tool that allows the team to say, that is a great idea. Here's our KPI, and we're on track to hit our target. And it just changes the conversation entirely from a litany of different ideas to we're actually executing and moving the KPIs, and that's actually what matters. It's a super critical feature of the KPI system, and it is the single hardest thing for people to do. Because if you work at a company, and let's say you're in senior management now at the company, or it's a company that you've started, you no longer get to decide what to do. And you can't do it. It's not your choice. You gave it away. You've given teams the ability to move their KPIs because that's better for the overall company, but you no longer have that authority. And that is really hard for people to do. And that was the point we realized that actually this was a social experiment. So I would like to say that we think it works. Far from perfect. Again, as Gilt reached several hundred people, I think this is way overkill for small companies. But as we reached several hundred people and saw backlogs start to explode, a lot of time spent on ideas and not execution. We look at it today, and teams are doing all sorts of great things. We have kind of a couple of assertions we make, like each of us wants to be surprised by something. It's just happening. You hear something and somebody's releasing this, and when one of the teams did Facebook login, another team is doing something called Bopper. It's like, what the heck is a Bopper? I don't know, but it's going out, it's in production, or it's going to production. Hoppers went to, and just this litany of things that now are happening across the company because the teams are focused on their KPIs. And we look at the KPIs, there's a server, lists every team's KPIs, you can see where they are, and that's the visibility. And we do think it enables innovation. It doesn't create innovation. It's kind of that difference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about people and focus on this category of people we call smart and autonomous people. And if we think about it, kind of what do smart people want? And there are a couple of high-level things, but a lot of the research says they want authority to make their own project decisions. Is a big deal. To build something that matters, particularly in engineering, to impact the business directly. It's like to know that the thing that you're working on is materially helping business, either by making it more efficient or by bringing the service to more people or by bringing more brands, in Gilt's case, more brands that our members love. Really having kind of that connection between what you're doing and the impact on the business. To work with great people. I personally define, so great is this kind of abstract concept. Like what is great? So we kind of define it as working with people that are better than you in one way or another, because that allows each of us to learn from that other person, and we seek that. I'm kind of thrown on here to develop a strong sense of well-being. And well-being is really carefully chosen as opposed to happiness, which a lot of kind of articles out there today about happiness. So the difference between happiness and well-being is that if you're happy, it's great. But then an event happens and you feel unhappy, and that's not so great. Well-being is the ability to absorb the events that happen and proceed in a kind of really productive way, kind of with your personal life, your life of your family, your friends, your peers, and so on. So really kind of focus on well-being. And so personally, I've been pretty heavily influenced by my father. I was born in Poland. He brought us to the US when I was very young. Typical American dream story. Got here, no money, nobody rented an apartment because we had kids, discriminated against kids at that time, and started his first company in the early 80s. He just sold his 8th company. in Silicon Valley doing kind of pretty high-tech stuff. So he's doing things like sensors on silicon, microelectromechanical systems on silicon, so really advanced science, dealing with problems like stiction, which is when atoms stick together. So amazing guy, serial entrepreneur. And I just remember this story. He's talking about people and how he always hired the best people, the smartest people. And he told the story of this one guy he hired who has 7 advanced degrees, 3 PhDs and 4 master's degrees, and 1 PhD in physics, 1 in material science, like advanced science. I mean, this guy, very, very smart. And he was making the wrong decision. My father was telling me this story. He says, and I know it. I did the same thing 10 years ago. I can just see it. And I can't do anything about it. Because I hired a smart, autonomous guy. I just he's not going to listen to me. He knows better. I mean, that's who I hired. And it's kind of eye-opening, and he had to wait 3 months, 4 months, and at the end of that, realized his mistake. And he corrected and went on a different path. And that's hard to do. So one camp is this idea to hire smart and autonomous people and then let them be smart and autonomous and creative. There's another path to hire kind of the command and control structure, which is, I think, pretty prevalent. So both models work, right? It's just a choice. And really, the lesson from my dad is that if you hire from the command and control structure and try to do autonomy, that's going to fail. If you hire from the autonomy camp and try to do command and control, that's going to fail. It's just to be really disciplined around kind of which one do you want? They both work. And then to remain consistent and transparent in that process. So come back to people and we think about all these things, really what they roll up to is this idea that actually great people just want to be trusted. That's it. It's like we're all working on the same thing. Trust me, I got it. If I need help, I'm going to come to you, and that's it. Like we're gonna do this. And so I want to focus a little bit on trust in engineering. This always makes me smile because we trust our engineers to write software. We trust them to manage our systems, to manage our databases. The question is, do we really trust their judgment? So if you think about it, the engineer has access to your database. They have access to every single customer record. They have access to all your credit cards. Maybe they have to collude with somebody else to get the credit card data, but it's all there. And so trust them to do that. Do we trust them to post to the blog? I don't know. Policy at Gilt is that anybody can post to the tech blog at any time, tech.gilt.com. Anybody, anytime. There's a shared Google Doc for the Tumblr account, password's there. And it's actually been really nice to watch because now all sorts of things show up on the blog. There's no friction. You want to share something with the world, share something with the world. And it's your choice. And while it's a micro example, it's an example of trust. And the alternative that you have to ask for approval to post to the blog is a micro example of distrust. And by itself, it's not a big deal. But all of those little things that we can do over time add up to this feeling of distrust. With the blog, it was kind of interesting. What happened organically is now when you go look at the Google Doc with the Tumblr account, there's a dozen people who listed their names, said, hey, if you want peer review or if you want somebody to help you copy edit, or if you just want somebody to review your writing, I'm here, reach out to me. But it's your responsibility and you're accountable, and please post because I trust you. Here's another one. So who can throw a party? This is an experiment we're doing right now. So anybody can throw a party. The small text says, as long as the spreadsheet still has money left. So the way this works is, if you think about employee recognition, and it's like, I'm working with this person, he's doing an awesome job. I'd love to take him out for lunch and say thank you. How do I do that? So write an email to my manager and say, this person is doing awesome. Can I please take him out to lunch and expense it for $30 or whatever? And then your manager has to think about it and say, well, I don't know if that's a good use of the funds. It's like, okay, fine, I'll take him to breakfast for $15. Like, okay, yes, take him for a bagel. And it's just one of those signs is you trust the employee to make the right decision or not? And fundamentally, the idea here is trust. And so in this model, we're in month 3. I think it's called the peer-to-peer budgeting experiment or something like that. I don't know. I can share the Google Doc later. But basically, it's a Google spreadsheet everyone has access to. In cell A1 is the amount of money that we're going to spend this month on fun. And then from there, if you want to take somebody for fun, you put your name, what you're doing, how much you want. And really complicated formula. Take A1 minus the sum of the dollars spent that month. If positive, cell stays green. If negative, cell turns red. If cell stays green, you go and do your thing. And a really interesting piece emerges from this, which is peer review. And that comes from the scientific community. It's kind of proven there. also has its disadvantages. But peer review is really compelling, right? If I'm going to take my team, we're going to go blow $1,000 on a steak dinner, which leaves like no money left for the other team, and they're out getting, I don't know, a cup of coffee because that's how they can celebrate. There's a disparity, and all of a sudden, I'm accountable to my peers. And that's what peer review does. It's what is the behavior that we think is right for Gilt, and then it just makes transparent what the approval process is. There's another interesting thing here that comes up, which is in cell A1, by middle of the month, it's 0. And we always want more money in cell A1 because it's fun. So how do we get more money in cell A1? And this is kind of where I hope the dots get connected. I don't know if we'll get there. The idea is that we have revenue targets at Gilt. We have profitability targets at Gilt. We are a profitable company. If we exceed those, wouldn't it be amazing if some of that went back and said, okay, we've exceeded our targets on the financial front, so A1 is now bigger because we've done well and we can share that success, at least for this quarter, back into the things. And then all of a sudden you have this transparent process that gets better over time when we're all working together and achieving our goals. And if we miss our targets, it should be less to celebrate, I think. And so that number can go down. And so we'll see if we can connect the dots all the way. But at least at this point, it's, again, transparent and just a complete trust and kind of this notion of transparency and built-in peer review, which is amazing. And so really what we're talking about here is that if decentralization, this idea that you can decentralize decision-making and authority, is actually a core component of all of this. And in general, in management here, we have this philosophy that we want to decentralize by default. So when a new question comes up or a new issue comes up, or can I, whatever it is, do we want to spend more money to buy hard drives for the server, whatever the thing is, when something new comes up, think hard about not the immediate yes, no, maybe, because that's subjective. It's like, can we decentralize this decision and put in place a framework that's transparent, that everybody understands, and allow the teams to make that decision on their own? And you can go too far with this. There's a great book, very short book, written by Derek Sivers called Anything You Want, which talks about how he ran CD Baby, which is an online site, late 90s, for emerging artists to sell their music online. And he decentralized everything. And it worked great. And then one day, his employees took him out of the profit sharing program. And he realized it had gone too far. And he couldn't recover from it. He couldn't, because he then took back control, which went against the decentralization that he had set up. And he ended up selling the company. So the book's great. It's called Anything You Want, 1 hour read, according to him. So it can go too far. And I think, like all things, complete centralization, complete decentralization are extremes. And everything else in the middle is a bit of judgment or gray. But the idea that kind of we found here is that really decentralize by default, and then look for what we call emergent centralization. So look for the things that actually are harder because they're decentralized. And the teams, where teams are actually asking for like, help, this isn't working, we need to actually centralize. Sometimes the teams will ask you by saying, can you please do your job and manage this? And those are the things that we can now look at and say, okay, well, we're going to consider centralizing this aspect of the business because here are the reasons that, here are the problems that we're trying to solve. We'll acknowledge they come with consequences, but really at that point we're making the decision that in this case, the pros are better than the cons. Centralization leads to bureaucracy and process. It's born out of a good desire. And I think the challenge then is just maintaining that over time or undoing it when it's no longer necessary. And so one of the things that we ran into is that as we started to decentralize the decision-making, this fear emerges. The fear is like, am I going to make the right decision? Am I going to make a mistake? Is it going to work? Am I going to cause the business to fail? It's this fear of errors. And a good example of this in software is that teams deploy stuff to production all the time. And there is no separation of responsibility. The developer who wrote the code is accountable for the code in production and will receive the call if it doesn't work. And so that's scary. You're going to deploy something to Gilt.com, and there's going to be a lot of traffic at noon. And if it doesn't work and you deploy to a core system, that's kind of a big deal. And that's fear of error can be paralyzing, right? You're too afraid to act. You want to do the right thing, you're just too afraid. So how do we combat that? And the idea is that really this transparency and real-time feedback are the solutions to that. Just how can we make it so that every action is as transparent as possible? And how can we make the feedback loop go from, I made this change, I got the feedback in real time, versus I made this change, next week the applications are a bit slower, and then my boss came to me and said, what did you do to make the application slower, right? We don't want that. It's like, I made a change, I want the feedback that it's working or not, so I can put that to rest and then go move on and do something else. And I'm going to spend a few minutes just to talk about enabling technologies, because there's a big, big role for technology here. And there are kind of three axes to this. And the first at Gilt is something called lots of small applications. If you can see my laptop, there's a sticker, which means it's real. Lots of small applications is this idea that we'd like each of the individual teams to have complete ownership of a piece of Gilt. They have their own code repositories. They have their own code. They are the authority on code quality and code review. If you want to submit a patch to them, you submit a patch to them, and they're the ones who accept your patch. They deploy it to production. They monitor it. And so in production, we have hundreds of small applications that are running. And the nice feature that it allows is that this application starts failing, it's very easy for the team to immediately know. And if for some reason they don't know, somebody can look at it and say, okay, yeah, that's we just launched a loyalty program, so that's web loyalty is having performance issues, or the error rate's 0.1% now. Okay, obviously it's a loyalty team. It's very, very simple to make that connection, and that's empowering. The second is something that at Gilt we call ion cannon, but it's this notion of continuous delivery. And this is the idea that if you can really deploy to production after every code commit, then when there is an error, you'll know right away and you'll know which change broke it. And the third is something called Galactica, which is essentially platform. It's our code name for platform as a service. So when a developer wants a new server, they get a new server in real time. They want to allocate a particular server with access to some special storage. It just happens. No waiting. They just get the resources on demand. So, and this is kind of the sequence. So let's start with lots of small applications. It's really lots of small emerge. So it's lots of small databases, lots of small teams, lots of small errors, really. And if you're into acronyms, that one is loser. So we think about that a lot. But actually, it's what we want. We don't want to go 3 months and have a big release and have a catastrophic event, and then we don't even know how to fix. What we really want is that make a small change, deploy it to production, boom, it works or it doesn't. If it doesn't work, roll it back, try again. That's it. Really, really simple to diagnose when things go right or wrong. The database one is kind of interesting. So what happens at Gilt, say you're working at Gilt, and this happens all the time, and you want to add a database table to an existing database. Initial reaction is like, -2 on the code review, why don't you create a new database? And really proliferate out the databases. And why do we do that? Well, if you create your own database, you own it, your team owns it, it's yours, and now you're the authority on the code quality and the quality of the schema and all those things. And by the way, if it runs out of space, you're going to know how to fix it. And we don't need to build up complex like enterprise systems to monitor kind of what's actually happening, right? Why is the database slow? Well, I don't know, there's 1,000 tables in it. What's happening? Are we missing an index? These are really, really hard questions to answer. The question we are really focused on is, this database is slow, which team needs to know, do they know? And getting better at that over time. Here's a great graph. This is the number of small applications in production at Gilt. And you can kind of see the uptick when we started the social experiment. Some people at Gilt will tell you we've gone too far on this. So we are considering evolving LOSA into MoMA, which is a moderate number of moderate-sized applications. And there's a great talk from Jake Krebs at LinkedIn on trying to understand what's the right number. That said, the nice thing about LOSA in software in general is it's easier to take two small things and compose them into one bigger one than it is to take a big thing and break it into two smaller ones, right? So the idea is that let's go all in on LOSA. We know it's not the end-all, be-all solution, and then if we need to compose over time, we can learn how to do that. And that's kind of the stage that we're at right now, actually feeling some pain from having too many and trying to work through that. This is what RI in Canada looks like. It's kind of amazing. So the software development lifecycle at Gilt is you write code, you push a code review, somebody reviews your code, you then merge it to master. When you're ready, you type SBT space release. SBT is Scala build tool. um, in the spirit of trolling, everybody should be using Scala and Play Framework and the tools from TypeSafe. So SBT, Scala build tool, release, enter, and you're done. Or SBT release dash remote, and then let the infrastructure build your application. What this manages is captures your intent that you're now ready to release your application. It could just be one change. A lot of times it is, or a few changes. And IronCAN will take your code, deploy it into a test environment. It'll build your artifact. It'll run all your tests against it. If they pass, it'll then create the RPM and publish it to a production repository, and then triggers a continuous delivery pipeline. Continuous delivery pipeline grabs the RPM, installs it into an integration environment, runs all the tests, runs all the functional tests, runs any tests contributed by any other team at Gilt against your thing. And if it all passes, says, okay, this thing is good enough to go to production, goes to production, takes the first host, deploys it to the first host, runs a series of health checks. If it succeeds, it goes on across the host. And essentially at any time you can drill in and see at which stage is it and what's happening, what's not. So it's this tooling is just required in the small application world. And it allows teams to continuously make their own decisions on when to deploy to production and get that feedback loop on what's working or what's not. At Gilt, noon used to be sacred, right? We used to never change code between like 11 a.m. Eastern and 2 p.m. Eastern because we did 75% of our revenue in that period of time. And so it was just sacred. You just don't touch production. As we rolled out IronCAN, kind of asked, like, do we still want to keep that blackout period that feels safe? The answer is no. People did not feel the need for it because of the automated testing that was happening as things were being deployed to production. So over the last kind of 6 months, we were actually able to remove that constraint on the organization, and things just deploy whenever they need. And occasionally there are errors or small errors that get rolled back right away, and things continue. It's kind of amazing. Here's kind of what we're working on right now around Galactica, and like Heroku. It's like, how do you bring Heroku level simplicity to your internal teams so that they can go do the things that they want? So like, give me space on a server, deploy my software to a server, add my server to the load balance pool, remove my old version from the load balance pool, and then at some point in the future you can garbage collect the old servers. And I think the important concept here is pseudocode. I don't know if it compiles. If it doesn't compile, it's the language it's written in has not yet been written. The really important thing about kind of Galactica or Platform as a Service is this idea that the teams are empowered to go get their own resources to run their things in production. Super important. There's no approval. They just have to be able to do that. That's what we're working on right now. And then there's this other idea emerging around immutability of infrastructure, which I think is just super exciting. And so if you followed functional programming, so object-oriented to functional basically means programming is immutable. It seems like a lot of work's happening right now around immutable data. So event streams and persisting event streams and storing object state as a series of events. The reason that's super powerful is because it has nice properties around scalability. And I think what's coming is this idea of immutable infrastructure. So it's just insane what we do. We just log on a server and update an RPM. Like, why would we ever do that? But we do it all the time. Have Puppet run and update our servers. They change our servers. Why would we do that? Really hard to reason about systems when things are changing all the time. And so the idea is moving in a direction where just don't change anything. Install a new version in production, maybe in a new VM or a new container, and then shift traffic to it, garbage collect the old one. And then either it works or it doesn't. Failure modes are great. You put traffic on the new version. If it doesn't work, put traffic back on the old version. It works as quickly as your load balancers can update, which is milliseconds. It's a really, really nice way. And then nothing is changing in production, which is a really, really nice place to be. So there's a project called docker.io. It's gaining a lot of traction. Comes from the guys at DocCloud. We're pretty bullish. I'm pretty bullish on it, and I think a lot of people at Gilt are pretty bullish on it. Some people at Gilt are not very bullish on it. But we're going to be spending a couple of weeks and seeing if Docker can really help us get to immutability. So it's something kind of top of mind to simplify infrastructure. I just want to introduce one other concept, which is this word antifragile. And friend Yoni, who's here, introduced this book a few months ago. And the concept of antifragile, I only read the first third of the book, but it was great. Recommend the first third of the book. Really, this summarized a lot of what we're talking about in terms of enabling teams to get instant feedback on what's working and what's not. And antifragile is the opposite of fragile. So let's see what that means. So take a fragile item, put it in a box, shake the box, open the box, item breaks. Right? You put a glass in a box, shake it, glass breaks. You take a robust item like a stone, you put it in a box, you shake the box, you take the stone out, the stone is the same. Take an anti-fragile item, you put it in a box, you shake the box, you open the box, it is stronger when you take it out. And it seems counterintuitive, how can that be? But then you look at our body, and how does our body work? If you run, when you run, what are you doing? You're damaging your body. Your body heals, and after it heals, it is stronger than it was before. And so it really kind of captures this notion that let's really make it transparent what's happening, encourage people to try lots of things, make it so that when the errors happen, they're isolated and small by having lots of small applications. And then when errors happen, have the discipline to put in the tests that will catch it next time. Because next time, the continuous delivery system will make sure that all those tests run. And actually what ends up happening over time is that Gilt and the systems we build in general, we're building a Gilt, gets stronger over time. And so this is really this idea of kind of a vision for creating systems that get better over time, which I think we can absolutely do. I think in closing, just come back. Great people do great things. Like, this is time proven. I think the idea and kind of the onus for all of us is really to empower them with real trust and to enable that trust with transparency and real-time feedback. And if we think about all the things that we want to do and attract people to join us in kind of whatever we're building, like it's just one of these fundamental things that when we have this conversation around, we are going to build great things, we are going to make this a great place for people to come and contribute, and we're going to do it in this way, is just an inspiring way to work. With that, we'll say thank you and love to take a few questions if there are any. Yes, sorry, here.
Just the KPI. Do you talk a little bit about how the process of developing a KPI for a team? Any generalizations in reaching what is the appropriate KPI that can be then used going forward?
Yeah, so questions, can I talk a little bit about the process of developing a KPI? So the first time we did this, we did the strategy, created the initiatives, and then we asked the teams to create their own KPIs, and that really didn't work. It was just too abstract. And so then second time around, kind of the group that created the strategy and the initiative sat down and debated how could we measure if we were successful at this, then what would it look like? And that really is usually, I mean, it's just a debate. Somebody throws out a straw man, you keep iterating, people go away, you come back, new ideas. And then once we start to feel good, we start to socialize those. And then as the teams form, now we have a basis to say, okay, well, here's kind of what we're thinking around the KPIs. What do you guys think? And they meet, and sometimes they change, sometimes they don't. And then, and depending on, some things are clearer than others. An example of something that's really hard at Gilt is as we launch a bunch of different sites, we launched our city business, our local business, food business, a men's business, a home business. All of a sudden, we had all of these applications. And so if you wanted to change the cart at Gilt, you had to go change 12 applications and write different code 12 times. And we decided that was actually no longer something that we wanted. We'd done that to go for optimize for time to market and for building beautiful experience in each vertical. So it's time that we kind of unified all of this. And so he said, what is the KPI for that? And the two KPIs that were maybe a little more personal, my suggestion was that actually we create this matrix of how many things you have to touch for the features that we care about. We measure how unified is our code base across Gilt. Let's make that the KPI for this team. And colleague said, well, what do you mean? Like they can work on anything they want? Won't have any business value, revenue impacts? Like, okay, so you're proposing we have a KPI around revenue impact to Gilt. So we can have one KPI or two KPIs. And this was actually fierce debate, right? It's like, and ultimately we chose, I think, was that we would give the team the KPI around unification only. And in practice, the team's gonna do the right thing, but we wanted them to do is say, even if there's this big opportunity to drive revenue, if it doesn't increase unification, you should not even be looking at it. And so then the team went away and looked at what are all the things that we can do that would improve unification, and that was the filter. And then they applied internally. Of course, everybody wants to improve business, right? And so just naturally, they were given the freedom to select lower revenue projects that drove the unification KPI. But that was an incredibly hard debate, and I think it would have been successful in either way. And then ultimately it's that. It's like a lot of debate, and then bring the team in. With the team, you finalize it, you can change it, and usually the team sets the targets as well. In the back there?
How do you handle documentation of all of the small applications?
Yeah, so the question is, how do we handle documentation and continuity across all of the small applications? So the short answer is that we don't. And that's an area of emergent centralization right now. And essentially, what we are doing in the process of doing right now is as the tech organization now is approaching Dunbar's number, one of the things we're doing is giving identity to the engineering team here in New York. We have a big engineering team in Dublin. And part of that's to accommodate the growth. And part of that also is to focus the teams on different things. And so part of what the Dublin team will focus on as a platform engineering team are things like tooling and it really things that developers can use to make it easier to build great software at scale. And they're actually measured by a KPI around voluntary adoption. And so really their measurement ultimately is how many teams are adopting the tools that they're producing. And if they're successful, that means that we actually see a lot of teams using the same tooling in the work that they're doing. And if they're not successful, then it's total fragmentation. And I would say we're kind of somewhat in the middle here. There's some areas where you see that emerging and tools are adopted and it's reasonably the same. There's some areas where it's just like, I know how to change these 6 things at Gilt, but what is this? Might as well be from another world. I mean, that happens. And that's one of the costs of this model, which is pretty significant, right? I mean, yeah. And I think over time, what we're learning more and more, kind of what are some of the things that actually we really should be investing in so that teams really do choose to adopt them to get that standardization to make contribution easier across all the different applications. So one other comment on maintenance. At some point, you have this application that's running and the team's moved on and they're working on a bunch of different things and there's a bug. And like, who fixes the bug? Well, nobody knows the code base. What's interesting in the microservices approach is now, the old days, your decision was fix the bug. In the microservices approach, your decision is, well, who wants to fix the bug? And if no one wants to fix the bug, then you can ask, well, is this thing still important? And if it's not important, it's actually simpler to turn off. So it gives you this other option, whereas in the past, you don't even have that option, right? The thing runs and you just have to keep feeding it because who knows what's going to happen if you turn it off. Yep.
Got 2 questions, if that's cool.
Yep.
So around KPIs, how do you sort of track them? And sounds like you've got 10, 15, 20 different KPIs throughout the company, if not more. So I guess you can show us. And then the other question, as far as having lots of different applications, you guys obviously have centralized data that different applications have to share. And so how does that infrastructure work?
Yeah, so in the KPIs, a couple of the people got together and wrote a KPI server. And they have graphs and we actually didn't touch on it, but you see strategic and tactical KPIs. Strategic KPIs roll up to the initiatives. Simple example is our security team has a strategic KPI of 0 data loss. However, that's not very useful in guiding everyday work. And so they create tactical KPIs around the things that they might do. Like how many new ways did you try to break into Gilt in the last 30 days? Would be one of their tactical KPIs. So that's all tracked here and drives kind of visibility. And then what we try to do is anytime we talk about how are things going, we do a progress review of a team. What we really like to do is open those presentations with the KPIs. Just reinforce this idea that actually it's the KPIs that matter. That's actually hard to do in practice. And sorry, your second question? Data?
Actually, can I ask a follow-up for that?
Sure.
The data that feeds into this, is that sort of the team's responsibility to make sure that it gets fed into the system?
Yeah, the idea is that there's a I'll put in quotes, management meeting every couple weeks. And it's actually a nice, something we're still learning, to be honest. But the idea is really nice, which is if you have this and it's just like it's moving or it's not, is it working? You never end up with this. You're really kind of avoiding surprise. And if something's working great, and it's like, what do you need to keep going faster? If something's not working great, is there something we can do to help? Or is this the wrong thing we're working on? And just takes all that emotion out, or that it's like, this is what we're doing. Like, if we like it or not, everyone agree, great. Let's keep working on it. Data is kind of interesting. So as we've as these things proliferate, kind of the unified view is harder. And one thing that we've done is kind of we kind of minimize, we don't want people talking to your database. They are allowed to talk to your services through clients. And that's where the data access comes from. And I think what's emerged, and then we do have a data warehouse. And what's kind of interesting is that the data warehouse becomes more important now, because in the past, developers could cheat, go to the one big database and get a unified view of everything. And in today's world, they can't. it's not big enough. So actually the data warehouse becomes a lot more important. What we think is the right model, although it is hard, is that you have these transactional stores that are private. You replicate interesting messages into an event stream, and we're using Kafka for that. And then what we tried first was read from Kafka and write to the data warehouse to make the data available. What we think is a potentially better model now is to read from Kafka, build to kind of a small OLAP database. So you have lots of small databases of your applications, lots of small OLAP databases, and that can be SQL. And now from a SQL database, small one, to a data warehouse is an easy ETL process. Or from there, you can go to like an HDFS and federalize the data. But it is a little bit more work. And then one of the interesting problems is data quality is a challenge. And so we made it very easy for any team to contribute any tests into the application. So I can run a test suite that runs all my ETL select queries as an example. And if you keep breaking my stuff, it's not your fault, it's my fault. But I know you don't want to break my stuff, but you just don't know. So it's actually my responsibility to give you a unit test to run. And then that's it. Now you make a change, you try to deploy your stuff. It's like, sorry, man, there's a bug. And you're like, it's cool. I'll just fix the bug, or I'll go talk to you. It's like a schema change. I got to make it. Here's why. Help me. So it's just a nice world in theory. And in practice, everyone's busy and competing priorities, and there's lots of, there are no silver bullets except for Fusion IO. So maybe you have I don't know if time for one more question if there is one, and then we can break. That might be it.
Well,
We have one question in the back, and then we'll break, and we still have drinks and everything, so we can.
When you describe in the autonomous teams and each team KPIs, in my mind I was asking, well, how do you ensure that these teams are not almost in conflict? What they're working on doesn't clash at some point. But
Yeah.
I don't know if maybe I can engineer to build that.
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. How do we know that the teams aren't in conflict? And to a certain extent, one of the reasons the initiatives are not decentralized is to prevent that from occurring. So if we choose good initiatives, we know that the initiatives roughly, when you collect them all, lead up to the corporate strategy. And in addition, we can choose initiatives that don't overlap significantly. Or if they overlap, we're conscious of it, and then it's just teams working together. And we have seen cases, and actually that one in practice, while it was kind of a fear at the beginning, in practice has turned out to be just fine. And recently what we saw happen is we had a few teams working on different aspects of personalization, and they just ended up forming one team. And that kind of emerged, and it's great, worked great. So we have a homepage because of that team, Gilt.com. It's amazing. We didn't have a homepage before, but you go to Gilt.com, and because of that team's work, it's like everything you've ever done, things you've clicked on, all that aggregates to show you the best of Gilt for you, and even based on when you last came. And kind of that emerged from actually a couple of teams working together on different aspects, and eventually formed one team. Well, just thank you all very, very much for coming tonight, and thanks, NYTECH again.